The poem Gentilesse by Geoffrey Chaucer takes us all the way back to the 14th century. And Chaucer's actually writing in what we call Middle English. So, Middle English, which comes after Old English and before Modern English. Shakespeare actually writes in Modern English, surprisingly. So we're well before that time, a couple of centuries earlier, and Chaucer gives us this lovely little poem about nobility, or gentilesse. To understand what nobility is, it's useful to start with a Bible passage here. And in Philippians 4, verse 8, we read, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things," which is a beautiful passage that also makes us think about the value of literature, right? Because literature can also be admirable and virtuous and make us wise ultimately. Not always, but it certainly can. So, as you can see here, one of these virtuous qualities that Paul mentions is nobility. But what do we consider noble, right? What is gentle? So Chaucer, writing in the 14th century, reflects on this question in the poem Gentilesse. And specifically, he's asking, can you be born noble? So if your parents are aristocratic, let's say, or is nobility more of a feature of action? Should you be acting noble? And that's really what Gentilesse is. As we get into the poem here, it's good to know something about what kind of poem it is. And we call this a ballade. So a ballade or a ballad, sometimes spelt with one L, sometimes with two. And a ballade typically had 3 stanzas. So 3 stanzas, each one with 8 sentences, 8 lines. And then often there was also an envoy. So the envoy had 4 lines, and it was used to address a specific person or to kind of reflect on the moral or the point of the poem. These ballads were normally about love, but Chaucer is actually writing here about a philosophical topic, right? Nobility. So that's possible as well and not entirely unusual. Chaucer's poem has a unique rhyme scheme. We call this rhyme royal, which you don't see in many other ballads. And the rhyme scheme goes A, B, A, B, and then B, C, C. Chaucer would actually end up using this in many other poems, in some of the Canterbury Tales, for instance, and all the way through his famous love story, Troilus and Cresside. Now, the last thing I'll mention here about the form of the poem is that Chaucer also adds a little refrain at the end of each stanza, and that's a wonderful way to give a little bit of a sense of conclusion, to hammer home the point, you might say, to really emphasize what the main message is. Let's start then with the first stanza, and what he describes here is a kind of metaphor. He uses a metaphor here. By referring to a stalk, he's really referring to a branch or a tree trunk. So if we think of a tree, right, and we have a whole bunch of branches, there we go, just draw sort of a simple picture of a tree, add some foliage. Okay, there we go. Now, what he's saying is that this trunk, this trunk here, is the father of Gentilesse. And most readers who look at this poem, they say, okay, well, this is probably Christ. There are a few other suggestions as well. So some people say it's God. Some people say it's Adam before the fall into sin. But we will assume that it's Christ. That's the most common reading, and it does definitely make sense. The point then is that Christ is the stalk, so the trunk, and we are the branches, right? And then, of course, the question is, will we bear fruit as well? Is there going to be some kind of positive outcome from this? The other metaphor here is about follow his trace, his footsteps. So do we follow in the footsteps of our ancestor, of our father, in a sense, who has taught us nobility, which here would be Christ? But just because you are a Christian, that does not automatically mean that you are noble. So what he says in the next bit is that you have to take your wittus, your intellectual faculties and your abilities, and you have to turn them in the right direction to soe virtu, virtu to soe, which means to follow virtue. So you have to not just claim that you are noble, you have to actually put it into action, following Christ's footsteps, address all your wits and kind of, gather them up, you might say, and follow virtue, and flee from vice, from wrongdoing. And then he adds, for unto virtu longeth dignite, another verse. So dignite here means something like honor and respect. We value people who have dignity. But just because you are powerful or rich or famous, that doesn't mean that you are necessarily virtuous, right? So, unto virtu longeth dignite, in other words, if you have virtue, you're a good person, then you will have dignity. People will respect you, whether or not you're poor or rich or whatever. But it doesn't happen the other way. You could be famous, you could be a politician, and yet have no sense of dignity because you are lacking virtue. The last little bit here refers to some of these famous people, and they are identified by what they are wearing. A mitre is the hat of a bishop. A crown, a krone, is obviously what a king wears. And a diadema, a diadem, is a crown for an emperor. And these were traditionally three of the most powerful people in the medieval Christian world. Let's move on then to stanza 2 here. And at this point, Chaucer zooms in a little bit and he wants to define nobility in more detail. And he gives us different descriptors for nobility. Some of these words are a little bit confusing, and in language studies we call these false friends. So words like true, for instance, they look familiar and we kind of go, okay, I think I know what this means, but it's actually a false friend because it sometimes means something quite different. The word troe here then means something like loyal. All right, so loyal. And you can see that in the word betrothed, right? In the word betrothed, you have the word troth or truth. So if you're engaged to somebody to be married, you better also be loyal to them. Then we have the word sobra, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you are not drinking alcohol, although it can include that as well. It really means a kind of solemnness, a seriousness. You're not just frivolous and being silly all the time. You're really dedicated to following the truth. Next, we turn to the word frey, which is perhaps the biggest false friend of all. This has more of the sense of being generous. So being generous and kind, hospitable, not being selfish or stingy. And obviously, if you want to be noble, you should be generous. You should open up your house to others, show kindness, give to the poor, and so on. And then we also find out that nobility has a spiritual aspect. So you have to be kleine of his ghoste or of your ghoste. And this means that your ghost is your spirit, your soul. So you have to be clean in soul or spirit and loved busyness. So you have to love busyness. But that doesn't mean that you have to be busy all the time. The opposite of busyness here is sloth. And in the Middle Ages, this was often understood in a spiritual way, as in you just don't show up to church. You don't do any good works. You show no care for your spiritual life. So it's not just about being lazy and sitting on the couch and watching TV. It's really about not being spiritual and not doing the right thing. And that's worth remembering today as well, that we shouldn't just think of sloth as being lazy, right? There are other ways to think of it that are more deeply spiritual. So the point here then is that all of these things lead to honesty, you might say. If you are an honest person, then you have these other virtues as well. And we finish this stanza again with our refrain. It says, "An but his ire love virtuous did he is noch gentle, doch riches same." So, you can be noble yourself, but your heir, the person who inherits from you, needs to love virtue, him or herself. You can't just rely on your ancestors being noble. And in the same way, you can't just rely on Christ doing everything for you and then doing absolutely nothing in response. Even though Christ saves you from your sins, there should be a response, right? You should be show your thankfulness and your gratitude and your love for Him in the way in which you live. The last stanza then, the third stanza, is maybe best introduced by having a look at another Bible passage here. And I've selected this one from Romans in this case. So in the letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul talks about what it means to be a child of Abraham, which is similar here to thinking about what does it mean if Christ is our father of Gentilesse. During Paul's time, this is New Testament times, a lot of the Jews were saying, well, we are children of Abraham. We are circumcised like him. And Paul suggests that circumcision does not automatically make people children of Abraham. Instead, you have to share a deep faith in God. So he says here, "And he, that is Abraham, is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised." The act of circumcision is only one part of being a faithful believer. So in this particular stanza, we see that Chaucer makes a very similar point. He says, "Vise my wel beaard old richesse, but there my no man, as men my will say, bequeath his ire, his virtues noblesse." In other words, you can inherit old riches. Your parents were rich. And that can make you full of vice. It's quite a common outcome, actually, that you inherit lots of money and it makes you full of vice. But it doesn't necessarily go the other way around. You can't just inherit money and expect to be noble, right? You cannot bequeath your nobility to your children. If you are noble, they have to live it out themselves. And the stanza continues. It says, "That is appropriate unto no degree." So appropriate means to belong legally to somebody, being possessed by somebody. And this line really says no social rank, no social estate, no class in society has an exclusive right to nobility. Anybody can be noble, including commoners and regular people. The point then is that to be a good Christian, you have to please the first father in majesty, right? You have to quaima, that means to please Christ through your actions. And we read about this also in the Bible. If you turn to the letter of James, for instance, he says things like, "Faith without works is dead." And he also points to Abraham and he says, in Abraham's life, faith was working together with his works. So we see that Christianity is not just about, well, I don't have to do anything, right? I'm saved. There is definitely a sense in which you have a responsibility as a Christian to pursue nobility, as we saw in Philippians 4 as well. At this point, you might very likely have a question, which is Chaucer's poem radical? It was written in the 14th century, and as you know, this is the Middle Ages. So, most people who thought they were noble were knights and earls and so on. They probably looked down on the lower classes quite a bit. That's certainly true. Would they have agreed with Chaucer that nobility is accessible to anybody? Well, it's a complicated picture, and the first thing we should recognize is that a lot of the nobility in this time did feel threatened by the lower classes. There's a good reason for that as well. If you go back a little bit in time to the middle of the 14th century, so in around 1348, we have the Black Death, which kills millions of Europeans. It's estimated that up to roughly half of the English population dies from the Black Plague. And this caused major problems, not only, of course, for the families who lost loved ones, but also for the labor shortage that resulted. Imagine that you are a peasant working on a farm, and you realize that the lord who owns the estate down the road really needs workers because half his workers have died. You think to yourself, okay, if I go there, maybe I'll get a better deal, get a better wage. So the aristocracy, the upper classes during this period, they tried to crack down on that. They said, you have to stay where you are, you can't travel without permission, and so on. And this led to a lot of unrest in the years that followed, to the point where in 1381, so in 1381, in England we have the Peasants' Revolt. The peasants, really the lower classes, are saying, listen to us, you have to listen to our concerns. And often they had reasonable concerns as well, although the violence that resulted was not always good. In this climate, then, Chaucer is writing his poem, and in principle, a lot of people would agree with him. They would say, yes, anybody can be gentle, anybody can be noble. But in practice, a lot of them would have said, okay, theoretically, a commoner can be noble, but it's just really rare. We're never going to see it in our lifetimes, right? So that was often the attitude that was expressed at the time. I'll finish here by pointing out how other authors dealt with this question as well, and they often had very clever workarounds to kind of say anybody can be noble, but in practice that doesn't really happen. And I've selected a passage here from Thomas Malory, who's writing at the end of the 15th century, so a century after Chaucer. And he writes all these stories about King Arthur and his round table, right? The Knights of the Round Table. And these are collected in a classic work which is called the Mort d'Arthur, or the Death of Arthur. So at one point in this story, we have a simple cowherd named Ares who comes to King Arthur's court along with his son Tor, and he says to King Arthur, this son of mine, I think he should be a knight. He's just different. And Ares says, I have 13 sons, but Tor doesn't fit in. When all the other sons are working on the farm, Tor just wants to shoot arrows. He wants to watch the knights jousting. He's also physically different. Somehow he's not the same. Could you please make him a knight? And here's the passage in Middle English. So Malory still just at the end of Middle English, you might say. The passage goes, "Nei ser, said Ares, this desire to be a knecht cometh of my son and not of me." Right? This desire to be a knight comes from my son and not from me. And by the way, in Malory's time, it's not entirely clear if people still say knecht or if that K is starting to be silent, if it's nicht. For I shall tell you, I have 13 sons, and all they will fall to what labour I put to them, and will be recht glad to do labour, but this child will not labour for nothing that me wife and I may do. But always he will be shooting or casting a dartes. Dartes are like spears, right? He's always throwing spears and shooting arrows, and glad for to say battailles and to behold a knechtes. And always die and nicht he desireth of me to be made a knecht. So it's a lovely passage, isn't it? It shows how Ares is kind of frustrated in a way. His son is not fitting in, and he says, can you please make him a knight? It sounds like we're getting exactly what Chaucer was talking about. Here is a commoner who's going to be made knight. But then Malory turns it around, and he says, he has Merlin come in, Merlin the magician, who says that Tor's father is actually not Ares at all. It's actually King Pellinore, who had a child with Ares' wife before the two of them were married. So Tor is actually the son of a king, after all. And Tor is a little bit like the ugly duckling who turns out to be a swan in the end. There's a reason he stood out. What you see here is typical of medieval stories, is that they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say nobility is accessible to everybody, right? Anybody can be noble. It's not about birth, it's about action. But then when it comes down to it, they often backtrack a little bit and say, yes, but it's more likely that you're going to be noble if you're born into it. So what we can take away from this poem is that the actual lesson here, the Christian lesson of nobility being something that means following in the footsteps of Christ, right, the fyrstestokk, is something that lasts all the way to today and beyond. This is not a message just for the Middle Ages, but is a powerful message for us today as well.